Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Hey, today's question comes out of the sermon on Sunday. If you missed it, then I encourage you to go back and to look. The reason is twofold. One is it's going to give perspective, make sense of this question, give you a context. But more importantly, the answer to this question will be found there. If this is your question, I'm not dismissing it or any shape or form, but I want to refer you back because this question in one form or another comes up a lot. And so rather than answer your direct question, I want to shift perspectives a little. So with that in mind, let's jump into the question. If God is only good and doesn't send or cause sickness even to teach us something, why does he allow it? Surely allowing sickness when he could stop it isn't good. Now, if this is your question, I'm not dismissing it. I understand it. This question reflects something that we all engage in at some point or another in our faith, and that is we look at God from our perspective and we wonder, because you're sovereign, because you're good, because you're holy, because you're omnipotent, and all those things, why don't you? And what we're really doing in those times is we're not exercising faith. We're out of our inability to comprehend the fullness of God. We are beginning to limit God by what we think he should do and what he hasn't done. And I want to flip that about. I want to suggest that rather than saying, God, why don't you intervene? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And then letting that shape our faith, we flip the question. You see, if we take as a starting point, as I talked about this on Sunday, that sickness isn't from God. It's the result of living in a fallen world. We opened the door that God had closed to sickness, to evil, to injustice, suffering. When we rebelled against God, in the Garden of Eden, and since then we've continued to rebel and let in the works of evil, the works of suffering, the works of injustice, the works of sickness. And these have nothing to do with God. These are the consequences of our choosing to reject God. The consequences are on us, not God. They're a reflection of us, not God. And so if we take that as our starting point, rather than saying, therefore, God, why don't you intervene? Instead of saying, why don't you heal this person? What if we were to change it and say, God, why do you heal anybody? You see, the reason I say that is by flipping it, it begins to allow us to see God's goodness and God's graciousness from a different perspective, a perspective that often we miss because we're looking at it from our side, not from God's side. You see, we don't deserve God's healing. We don't deserve God's goodness, God's graciousness. Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. In other words, even today, those of us who are Christians still live lives that offend against God's goodness, God's graciousness, against God's righteousness, against his holiness. And yet, God still intervenes. God still acts on our behalf. We still see evidence of God's goodness and God's grace at work. We still see some people being healed. Instead of saying, why doesn't he heal everybody? Why don't we say, God, why do you heal today? Why do you intervene? You know, it would be great if he did it in every circumstance, but he doesn't. But instead of looking at where he hasn't, if we look at where he has and we let that be that which causes us to focus on or to pose questions, we begin to say, God, given that we've offended against you and given this is what we're experiencing are the consequences of our choices to rebel against you, why do you still intervene? Why do you still work on our behalf? Why do you still heal? Why do you still deliver? Why do you still protect us? And if we start there, we begin to see that it's because of God's goodness, God's graciousness. We begin to see what we'd otherwise missed, and that begins to build faith, because our faith should never be predicated on circumstance. It should never be predicated or built upon what God may or may not do in the future. It should be based on what he has done. Through the cross of Christ, he has cancelled the power of sin so that we are no longer bound by it. We have the freedom to choose to turn away from it and to turn to God. or to persist in our rebellion. But either way, we begin to see that through that we now have what we had lost, and that should then begin to serve as an impetus for us to align ourselves more fully with God. Instead of saying, God, why aren't you doing this? We look for where God is at work, and we give thanks, and we say, God, how can I experience more of that in my life? And we begin to deal with whatever needs to be dealt with. But it also then serves as an encouragement to be as Christ in a broken world, to bring his justice, to bring his healing, to bring his mercy, to his goodness to bear wherever we find ourselves, so that our lives begin to work for his good, rather than just questioning and waiting for him to intervene sovereignly. So that's not the answer you're looking for, but as I say, this comes up. I've answered if you look in the playlist before in one form or another, but I just want to take the moment just to flip it around and say, instead of looking at what God hasn't done, let's ask the question, why do you heal when we don't deserve it? Why do you act on our behalf even when we don't deserve it? So that we keep ourselves humble and we keep our faith focused on the goodness and grace of God in ways that it should be. So, yeah. Hey, I would love to hear your thoughts. Why not post them in the comments below? But as always, if you've got questions, you can ask them on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC23. Would love to hear from you. But that's it for now. Until next time, God bless.